Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome all our guests, Senator Jacinta Collins particularly, but the wonderful turnout here I think is a great testimony to the interest in the topic tonight. This is the third in our series of Future of Energy series run by the Melbourne Energy Institute at the University of Melbourne. The Melbourne Energy Institute started a little over a year ago with the ambition to try and bring together the collective powers of the university on challenging issues to map our energy future. And we set out very early on, soon after a book was published by Cambridge physicist David Mackay in 2008 called Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air, to try and look at how we might map sustainable energy systems within the Australian context. David Mackay showed that sustainable energy options for the UK and Europe are rather limited. The UK in particular is a small island with lots of people and lots of cloud. And he concluded that it was not possible for the UK to build a sustainable energy systems around renewable technologies, and they'd have to either import from another continent, such as Africa, or use nuclear to get to a low emissions energy system. Of course, Australia is very different. We have 1/3 the population. We have a population density which is about 1/100th of the UK, and we have twice the sunlight. So our options are rather different. And we set out within the Energy Institute to try and understand how we might look at the options we faced as a community here. We're very pleased some months ago to launch our first in our Australian Sustainable Energy series, a book by Professor Peter Seligman, Australian Sustainable Energy by the Numbers, which set out to look at the options we might have in Australia and how we might build an energy system based on zero emissions over 25 years. It's a great pleasure tonight to launch the second in our series, the Australian Sustainable Energy Series, the Zero Carbon Australia Stationary Energy Plan. This is an initiative which is a partnership and a collaboration between Beyond Zero Emissions, an independent research organisation, which hosts a great number of our own students from this university. And so the collaboration grew out of our own students who have worked on this project and beyond zero emissions. It's a great testament to the enthusiasm, intellect and promise of our students in particular, who have made a huge impact in putting this plan together. And as director of the Melbourne Energy Institute, I'm very proud to represent that component here today. In our Future of Energy series, we're interested in looking at the options, openly discussing the pros and cons, the costs and benefits associated with particular energy options. And today we're going to focus on Australian renewable energy systems from both the point of view of the plan, as articulated in the book just launched, but also from industry perspectives and other people who are interested in understanding how our energy systems might work. So it's a great pleasure to invite a group of speakers and panel members along to lead this discussion. In particular, I have great pleasure in inviting Matthew right up to lead off the discussion. Matthew is Executive Director of Beyond Zero Emissions, and along with Patrick Herbst from the University of Melbourne, is one of the two lead authors, along with a vast list of other people, and I would like to read them out, but I think it would take too much time. But I would like to thank them all for their contributions and invite Matthew up to give us an outline of the plan.
Look, thank you very much, Mike, and thank you to the University of Melbourne's Energy Institute for inviting us along and participating in this project, which is really appreciated by the team. And obviously I'm sharing the work here that 30 people have put together roughly. So it's a pretty big effort, and the team have been pretty excited by the outcome that we're here and actually releasing this project, this very exciting project that we can repower the economy with 100% renewable energy. Now, so if we just look at that's obviously the book. It's available for sale, and it's to actually achieve that. We had lots of people who participated by donating and giving their administrative assistance and their pro bono research time, so tens of thousands of dollars of research time put in by people from around Australia, and a lot of those here in Melbourne. Now, if we just look, the climate science is pretty clear, and it's in the first chapter of the book, and we know that the US Navy is saying that the complete loss of summer Arctic ice could occur by the summer of 2013. So that's the summer Arctic ice cover, and that's a big reflector and something we don't want to happen. But we'll move on right now because we've heard the climate science over and over again, but not that quickly. No, that's all right. There's this great group. I don't have control of the slide. So there's this big, well-resourced, well-networked, well-connected group moving in and out of the halls of government. They've got the ears of relevant ministers in the public service as well, and there's countless numbers of them, but unfortunately it's not us. It's the Can't Do campaign. And the Can't Do campaign are the lobbyists that are in-house at the oil and gas industry, the generators, the coal exporters. They're in third-party lobbying firms, and 1 minute they work in government, next minute they work for the lobbying firms and ratchet their pay up some more. And meanwhile, they're doing the bidding of the fossil fuel industry. And one thing they do in terms of their public awareness campaign is they teach us all the Can't Do mantra. And the Can't Do mantra is that renewable energy can't supply baseload power, renewable energy is too expensive, renewable energy will wreck the economy, renewable energy will cost jobs. So a group of us set out to ask the question, can renewable energy power the economy, and can it do it for a price that we can afford? So we decided to put together the Can Do campaign. So the Can Do campaign were a bunch of researchers, young and old. They were very keen on achieving the goal and doing thorough, extensive research to find out if you could do that. After a slow start, when we really got our learning on how to work together, we put together this project, and it's a real testimony to their hard work. And we've got people from academia, from regulatory, from industry. They're mechanical engineers, electrical engineers. We've got PhD candidates from universities, and they're in the relevant fields. They work in the existing fossil fuel or did before in the fossil fuel sector. So it's a really good team effort and the right team for the job. So this is the stationary energy plan, and Beyond Zero Emissions, and hopefully in partnership with the University of Melbourne Energy Institute, we'll be putting together a plan on the transport sector, industrial processes, and buildings, and land use change, forestry and agriculture. So we'll be looking at each sector of the economy. The buildings and transport plans, which we're attacking next, feed directly back into those efficiencies, those energy figures feed back into the next version of the stationary energy plan. So basically, why do we need to know that we can do it in a decade? Well, this is Professor Hans-Joachim Schellenhuber. He's from the Potsdam Institute, and he advises Angela Merkel and the European Union on what they need to do to address climate change. And he says that if we have an equal carbon budget per capita, per head of population, from 1990 baseline, then the budgets of the United States, as you can see there, will be exhausted by around 2020. Now, Australia has a higher per capita emissions than the United States, so we can see that we need to ride roughly that black curve and decarbonise our economy. So first thing we need to do is to know that we can do it, and that's the first part of the project, and that's what we've done. And Al Gore, really, he says a political promise to do something 40 years from now is universally ignored because everyone knows that it's meaningless. 10 years is about the maximum time that we as a nation can hold a steady aim and hit our target. So in other words, if you go for 2040 or 2050, it actually means do nothing now, do nothing tomorrow, and just talk about it. And we decided talking's too much, and we need to do it. And this fits well within the Professor Mark Jacobson from Stanford, and he's done a more high-level plan than ours on how you take the world to renewable energy by 2030. And of course, Australia being a leading OECD country, having such a great renewable resource, the renewable resource in Australia is the equivalent to the United States', but we only have to power the equivalent of Texas. So it's not a very hard challenge. Australia's the easiest place to do the job. So traditional power generation, you basically heat up water, becomes steam. Steam gets forced through the blades of the turbine, which drives the generator, and out comes electricity. Your light's powered. Now you can power that reaction. You can power that with a nuclear reaction. You can burn gas. You can burn coal, or you can use solar power to drive that. And the two most common types of solar thermal plants that are being rolled out commercially are parabolic troughs and power towers. Australia's a leader in another technology, which Keith will tell you about from ANU shortly. Dishes, which are on the cusp of commercialisation now. So parabolic troughs were originally commercialised in 1912 in Meedi and near Egypt, and basically they had a plant operating. World War I broke out, and that was the end of that. So we had a bit of a false start. Then we had the fast forwarding. They were the cut-out slides to shorten the talk. So basically, here's how the solar thermal molten salt power tower works, the ones that we've specified in our plan. You basically have a big store of salt in the bottom right there in the cold salt tank. It's 290 degrees cold, and it's industrial fertiliser basically, potassium nitrate, sodium nitrate. The salt gets pumped up the tank, receives heat from a sea of mirrors that surround the tower. That's a mirror field. That salt then comes down the other side and is banked in the hot tank. So whether you need power day or night, you can just keep banking that heated up salt. And when you do need power, at any time you pump water past a heat exchanger, that gets flashed to steam, that then gets forced through a steam turbine, the same as a coal, gas or nuclear plant's turbine, and out comes electricity. So it's pretty straightforward. You hold your heat in a giant thermos flask, and we all know about thermos flasks. So in terms of the prototype and testing stage of these plants, we need to go back to the 70s and 80s when they were being built, the test plants at 5 and 10 megawatts, at 2 megawatts back in 78 there in France, where they were testing molten salt storage. That was all done back in the 70s. And in the 90s, they did a larger scale commercial demonstration with the US Department of Energy run by Lockheed Martin in conjunction with their commercial partners, and that was Bechtel, Boeing and Rocketdyne. Rocketdyne Laboratories are the guys who put the Apollo space rockets up, and they proved up molten salt storage power towers for commercial operation. Unfortunately, George Bush got into power and tried to scrap the US Department of Energy's solar program, so that was a bit of a knock there, a bit like the World War I took out the parabolic troughs. So, move in Spain. Now, as a bit of a rearguard action, the US Department of Energy shared all its intellectual property, as did Bechtel, with the Spanish. They were the only ones interested at the time. I don't know why Australia didn't have the doors wide open as well. And so the Spanish started building plants, and they've got $20 billion of plants out to 2013 under construction right now. So it's a big rollout. The big companies involved include ACS Cobra, who's represented here tonight on the panel. I think BrightSource has got a project for Spain earmarked. No, BrightSource is aiming to US projects. So basically, these projects already operate, and quite a number of them, where they can dispatch power any time of day, 24 hours a day. And they're the andesol plants at the top and those power towers at the bottom. So here's a range of the companies that are doing that. And you can see that there's lots of them, and that's not even all of them. Go to the next one. And in Spain, you've got 60 power plants getting built out to 2013. It's a big construction job, and like I said, ACS Cobra is probably building about a third of those. So here's the kind of plant we're speccing. There's a Spanish company that sells them, and there's a US company. The US company is owned by United Technologies Corporation, the company that does Carrier air conditioning, and they're building a 50 megawatt plant in Spain, a 100 megawatt plant in Nevada, and a 150 megawatt plant in California. And this is what a tank looks like. There's about 40 of them down at the Altona mobile refinery. It's just a standard carbon steel tank. The salt's refined very pure, so it doesn't corrode the tanks. So our grid is wind plus solar thermal with storage, and that's how you get basically 100% renewable energy supply. Okay. So this is a fairly detailed diagram. This is called a Sankey diagram. It basically says if you follow the coal into the power station, that's the big blue bar comes off. You can see that most of the power plant, most of the coal energy's heat goes to losses, okay? And a pinstripe services the economy. So the stuff on the right is delivered energy, and the stuff on the left is primary energy. We only need to worry about delivered energy when we're planning our renewable energy future. And here you can see we've modelled some energy efficiency into the mix. We come down by 2020 well above where Germany will be on a per capita basis of electricity per person. And we actually increase the amount of electricity in our grid because we're fuel switching transportation. We're electrifying our transport. In The Age, it was reported yesterday that Lloyd's is now saying the possibility is $200 a barrel oil as early as 2013. And they did that under is it Chatham House rules, where everyone doesn't say who they are and admits what's wrong with the world. So, so here's a look at our delivered energy. So on the left is the delivered energy today, like you saw on the right-hand side of that big chart, and it involves a significant portion of energy that's delivered as fossil oil and gas. Because we're eliminating fossil oil and gas, we obviously have to electrify a lot of services. We're using renewable ambient heat, which you can't see there, so we use heat pumps in order to deliver heat. We use direct solar. We use bioenergy. It is used today in wood heating and some other biomass, bagasse and stuff in Queensland. You can see here that our grid is 60% solar thermal with storage and 40% wind power. We've built a national grid, and there's a small proportion, and it's mostly, we think, due to limitations in our ability to model, of biomass co-firing of the salt tanks. So in the worst case of winter, we actually, instead of sending the salt up the tower to receive heat, it actually goes on a bypass loop and cops some biomass co-firing. This equals less than 2% of the power we deliver from those solar power plants. So this is the national grid that we could have in 2020 if we decide to act now, or if we decide to act in 2012, we could have it by 2022. You've got high voltage DC lines, the same as Basslink, are in red. In green, we've got high voltage AC, predominantly to bring wind power into the grid. The existing grid is in white overlaid, and you can see 12 solar thermal power regions and 23 wind regions. So for 60% of our energy, we're using solar thermal with storage. Each module, so that's a tower that's the same as a smokestack at Loy Yang Power Station. Instead of billowing smoke, it receives the solar radiation. It is there 250 megawatts gross, so you compare that to a 200 megawatt gross turbine at Hazelwood. Hazelwood's made up of 8 turbines, so if you want a Hazelwood equivalent, you build 7 of these. That's the sort of numbers involved. For wind power, we're using commercially available now Enercon turbines. All this is commercially available now. 6,400 turbines, 23 geographical sites. They're being built now overseas. We can build the manufacturing capacity here as well. So if you look at China, China's driving the cost reductions. They've grown their wind industry at 100% growth per annum for the last 4 years, and they're putting real downward pressure on the price of wind. So we can see those benefits coming through, and we've integrated that in our plan. So here's some of our modelling. This is 2008 daily data, so we've taken past years and we've run an upscaled version, so our 2020 grid against the real meteorological data that came out of those years at those sites, and in half-hourly increments, and we've shown that we are delivering a reliable, firm, secure energy supply matching demand. Sinclair Knight Mertz, through their corporate social responsibility program, were able to donate to us significant help in designing our transmission system and reviewing it, and they say the review finds that the transmission scenario proposed is technically feasible in terms of capacity and reliability. In addition, the proposed transmission uses mature technology with proven capability around the world. It actually represents about 25% of the cost of the plan, so we can't ignore the need to modernise and upgrade our grid. It can't stay the 1960s, 1970s grid that we've been sitting on for the last 10, 20 years. So in terms of jobs, we've done a detailed analysis based on real projects that are currently under construction, operating, or in the pipeline. The actual ongoing operations and maintenance of these plants would be about twice what we're using in the domestic electricity sector at the moment, so from 20,000 jobs up to 40,000 jobs. In construction terms, we'd be talking a peak of about 80,000 construction workers in order to roll the wind energy, solar thermal plants and the transmission out. Now, in context, prior to the global financial crisis, the construction industry was growing at 50,000 jobs per annum, so there's no big deal in reaching that. You can see the mining and energy sector at the bottom. They make a lot of noise about jobs, but they're not as big as construction, manufacturing, and professional services, which are at between 1 million 800,000 and 1 million jobs. At the top in green is our jobs pulse there, and you can see that compared to what the jobs are in electricity, gas and waste today. So we looked at all the resourcing requirements. Here's an example: concrete, 7% of the nation's concrete on 2008 numbers is what would be required each year. So we either expand concrete by 7% or we find some uses that weren't required and we allocate that resource. So there's definitely stimulus there. In steel terms, you can see it's less than we produce here domestically required for the job. And if you take it in net iron ore export terms, well, we've got a lot of steel to play with. We've also looked at the significant cost reduction trajectory that the US Department of Energy showed in some reports they did up to 2000 in their solar power program at Sandia National Security Labs, the US Department of Energy labs. And they showed that the price of solar thermal power could get down to the cost basically of wind power once you hit about 2,600 megawatts, or say 1.5 Hazelwood's worth installed globally, and down to the cost of conventional new coal plants if you get out to 8,700 megawatts, or about 5.5 Hazelwoods installed globally. Now, a due diligence-like study was done on that. This was part of the process where Bush was trying to close down the US Department of Energy's solar programs, and that was done by Sargent & Lundy, a large engineering firm in the United States, similar to SKM or Worley Parsons, and they backed up the numbers. The only difference in it was their projection on how much could actually get rolled out, but that was based on political considerations. So we can take these reliably as a good assessment of as you cumulatively install the capacity, like they're doing in Spain, the price comes down. So here's a breakdown of the costs. You can see the solar thermal plants are a significant proportion, the biomass backup heaters. The wind power is a bit cheaper for the amount of power you get, but obviously you need the augmentation, so you need to balance the amount of dispatchable power to the amount of variable power you've got, and the cost of the transmission. And transmission is about 25%. So for $37 billion a year, or about 3% of GDP, and now if you do that in terms of electricity prices, what will it mean to a family or a household? Well, we ran this through the Australian Energy Regulator's model for deemed monopoly assets. So it's really aimed at transmission assets, which are usually owned by one supplier and they're not open for competition. So they offer a guaranteed sort of rate of return to private operators. So as one model, just to give you a benchmark, we said how much will it cost? Well, it increase electricity prices by about 6 to 6.5 cents per kilowatt hour delivered. So in other words, for domestic households, it'd be about the average household, the average family, $8 per week they'd be buying into an Australia-wide renewable energy economy. So here's out to 2040. Our systems actually costs about the same based on the model Stern used. And so you can see, but from then we're actually benefiting, we're ahead of business as usual. But if you take into account oil, and this was using much more conservative numbers than $200 a barrel in 2013, we'd actually be well ahead. So we've got a good $1.5 trillion or more there to play with to actually build the railway infrastructure to electrify our transportation. So basically the choice is the mirror, 1 square metre of mirror, or you burn 20 tonnes of coal. It's our choice, it's the government's choice. You go the mirror or the coal. Let's put it another way, you choose not to burn if you choose not to build that 1 square metre of mirror, you are choosing to burn 20 tonnes of coal and create the added environmental degradation and the health effects to Latrobe Valley workers from the asbestosis mesothelioma, highest cancer rates in the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. We will have time at the end of the session for discussions for the speakers and panel members, so we'll move on now, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Keith Lovegrove from the ANU. Keith is well known for his continued work in developing solar technologies, one of the researchers who we managed to keep, in fact, through times when we weren't able to keep all our researchers in this area, so it's a great pleasure.
Good evening, everyone. I've got even more slides than Matthew and less time, so I thought I'd actually do the carriage returns myself and do it from up here. First of all, let me congratulate Matthew and Patrick and the rest of the team on an excellent job. And really is about can-do. We've got this really interesting situation now where all around the world, almost all sides of politics are acknowledging the importance of the greenhouse problem, but we're not quite doing anything much about it just yet. We've also got a situation where it's really hard to find anyone in the community who doesn't actually like renewable energy, but on the other hand, a lot of sort of nervousness and scepticism about can it do it? Can it really do it? And I think if we look around this audience tonight, I suspect that many people in this audience probably fall in that camp. You like renewable energy, you think it's good, but you're not sure if it's ready. And putting together a report with that sort of detail in it really helps us a lot. Now, what the team have done is do one scenario, and they mentioned that in the forward. The fact that you can do one particular scenario, and if I did the report, maybe I'd do a different scenario, but if one scenario works, others will work too. It actually strengthens the conclusion that they've managed to show how it can be done with actually a fairly narrow selection of technologies. So there's other ways of doing it. It's even easier in a sense than that portrays. So let me see what I can offer you tonight. I've got a lot of slides here which are going to, having seen what Matthew's shown you, I'll just skip over it, so I won't explain how it works. Just emphasise there is that long history, there's 20 years of operation, and emphasise too that steam turbines are where most of our electricity comes from, and the fact that the solar thermal approach uses the same prime mover, if you like, makes the concept of a rapid scale up that much more plausible. I will say, however, as a solar thermal person, that don't neglect the photovoltaic option. You're going to see a lot more of it, and in actual fact, the photovoltaic people have done very well at bringing the prices down, and thin film stuff coming out of China now is looking very competitive, which actually brings us to the storage advantage of solar thermal, which is really why the team have picked on that, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. Matthew's already covered this sort of stuff. Just to say that Prof is the most mature technology, so now you've got multiple suppliers, in a sense, competing on price in that field. Tower Systems, a range of players there. It's not quite as mature as the Prof technology, but it's next cab off the rank. The linear Fresnel is an interesting one to watch. Those of us who sort of favour the high concentration options figure that the better efficiency from the higher temperatures is going to outweigh the slightly more complex nature of the things, but the linear Fresnel people say, no, we're going to go simple. We think we can do it by reducing the cost, even though it's a somewhat lower efficiency. So we'll see how they go. On the storage thing, let me just say that Matthew showed pictures of the Hemosolar plant and talked about this molten salt idea. I just want to show you that picture. I think he had it as well. This is the existing plant. Andesol 1 has been working for how many years, Matthew, now? Right. So we've already got nearly 3 years of a commercial plant with storage. Now, let me just say why solar thermal is somehow linked to storage. If you think about making electricity directly somehow with a wind turbine or a photovoltaic cell or something, and then you say, I want to store it. Well, the problem is to take electricity and do something with it. You could imagine an analogy to a battery, or you can do pumped hydroelectricity, you can do something, but you have to take your electricity and invest in another system whose job it is to take in electricity and then give out electricity. It's an extra investment you have to make after building your generating system. A solar thermal plant, on the other hand, goes, first of all, collect the sun, make something hot, then take the heat, do some power generation. Well, you can insert your storage at the I've made something hot point in the process, and you can do your storage before the power generation. Why is that an advantage? Well, just heating things up and keeping them in a tank is pretty simple. I mean, that's molten salt storage. It's just hot liquid in a tank. It's no more rocket science than your hot water tank at home. So it's conceptually and technically easier, but because you've done your storage before you've generated the power, you actually can reduce the size of your power block if you so choose and actually save a bit of money. So really, with a thermal system, the storage is fully integrated into the system's design, so it's not so much of a capital cost penalty, and of course it's technically easier. So this is the only really commercially operated utility scale solar energy storage in the world, but it's there and it works. There's other ways of doing it. You can heat up graphite, you can split ammonia, that's something we've been doing at ANU for many years. You can heat up concrete, you can heat up rocks, you can try using phase change for doing the storage. So there's an enormous range of other alternatives, let's say on the books in demonstration R&D phase. Here's one that works at a commercial level already, so it's there, you can do baseload solar. Dish systems are what I happen to do, and more about that in a second. This is what we've been doing at ANU. How's my 12 minutes going, Matthew? I've done about a quarter of the slides. So this is, in case you didn't know, the world's biggest solar dish, right? It's the least mature of the 4 approaches to solar thermal, but we think it's got a future, and it's because of the highest concentrations, highest temperatures you can achieve. So 500 square metres, 4 times bigger than anyone else's solar dish. Matthew showed you the Sargent and Lundy cost reduction projections, just to make a point that the analogy to the wind industry, you've got a history there of 2 decades of exponential growth in installed capacity that's matched with an exponential decay in installed costs. So it's not as if, so when Sargent and Lundy make those projections, there's analogous industry to call upon to say that that cost reduction is plausible. Let me just show you this map. This is direct normal radiation in some places, particularly India and China. Really, in terms of greenhouse in the future and everything else, actually it comes down to what happens to India and China, because that's where all the growth is in energy consumption in the world. And really, if those 2 countries don't do it, we're in pretty poor shape. But the answer is they probably will do it, and they'll probably wipe the floor with us while we're doing it, and we'll just miss the boat. Because look at this. We're pretty pleased that we finally embraced the solar flagships. We're going to build 1,000 megawatts of solar by 2015. Well, India is going to do 20,000 megawatts of solar by 2022. Small typo at the bottom there. So they're doing, 20 times more than us in a slightly longer time scale. If they do it, they'll be the world leader. Okay? So what will that mean? It means we're probably going to be importing Indian technology. Well, that's an interesting prospect. Now, think about this. Well, we've got a plan for 100% stationary energy. That's great. How does Australia earn its money? It exports coal. Well, we better think about that, really, as a country. And given that the Indians are going to build the technology before us, so we're going to import Indian technology, or Chinese, maybe. Don't forget, there's the whole oil issue that we had alluded to there. Oil is still, 3 minutes left, still the single biggest source of primary energy in the world, and it ain't going away too soon. Have a look at this. The top thing is taken from the Australian Energy Resource Review that's just come out. It's very informative to look. Petajoules are amounts of energy, and what we export and what we import, and there's an enormous number of petajoules of coal exported from Australia, and oil goes in both directions, but an enormous number of petajoules there. There's also an enormous number of petajoules of uranium exported from Australia. It's almost half as much as the coal in energy terms. Notice the column that says value in $1 million. So the coal one, the 24 billion a year, is largely what keeps our balance of payments healthy. You could work out, right, so it's very interesting to take a ratio there, and that's what I've done in that table down there. And what you see is that coal is, in terms of dollars per amount of energy, is pretty middling to average, but not too bad. Notice the uranium one there. Uranium is not worth very much money in dollars per unit energy. The last thing you want to be is in the business of selling the cheapest fuel, right? So a big switch to nuclear around the world, even though Australia has enormous percentages of the uranium, we won't make much money out of that ever. No future for our economy that. Look at the value of oil products. That's the most highest value energy traded in the marketplace today, if you will. And consider this, we do produce oil, but we produce less and less of what we need, and that's not going to change, I don't think. Think about this. The cost of oil, Matthew, you just alluded to the idea it might be $200 a barrel or something. I think it's been as low as $30 a barrel, gone up, touched $100, but I'm not sure, there's better qualified people than me, but the idea it might be hovering in the sort of 70 to 100 or 50 to 100 range in the coming years. What does that actually mean? There's a whole lot of technologies that become economic, sort of alternative oils, if you will, above about $50 a barrel, and one of them there is deep water drilling, which is all about what's happening in the Gulf of Mexico at the moment. So all of these more expensive oils come with a huge question mark, and all the ones over on the right, the oil shales and the coal to liquids, they're about getting oil equivalents with a much, much worse greenhouse signature. So that's a frightening prospect, and they're all about to become economic, and there's nothing in place to stop people pursuing those things. So what about that? Well, how about this for an idea? Why don't we use solar concentrators to process hydrocarbons? We can also aim for splitting water and making hydrogen. We can do these things, and that's also a can-do proposition for you. A lot of the technology exists. You can actually tap into the technology developed for coal to liquids, drive it with solar energy. Matthew, if you could just look the other way for a second. Okay, it's done. That's how it works. I'm wrapping up. Supposing we wish to provide all of Japan's primary energy, we wanted to export energy to Japan, well, that's how much of our continent. If we did that, our economy's set up forever, and it doesn't matter how many of the components we end up buying from India or China, we've got the sun, and we can export the sun, and that's a pretty good competitive advantage. So thank you all.
Thank you very much, Keith. One of the things we try to do in these seminars is to bring together the different perspectives from academia, from industry, and so it's a great pleasure now to invite Lane Crockett up. Lane Crockett is General Manager of Australia for Pacific Hydro, to give an industry's perspective on Australia's renewable energy future. Thank you, Lane.
It's a slide-free presentation, that's why it's hovering. Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Professor Sandiford. Last Thursday, a solar-powered plane broke new boundaries. It flew through the night unaided by any other fuels, and during the day it ascended to an altitude of more than 8 kilometres while maintaining fully charged batteries. Now that sort of success only comes from when we aspire to create a better future. So I'm very pleased here to be here this evening as part of the launch of the visionary report and challenging report from Beyond Zero Emissions. But I say not challenging in a negative sense, but in the sense that it will challenge the view that this sort of plan is not technically feasible. For too long, Australia has been delaying its action on reducing emissions and using the excuse that technology does not exist or cannot deliver a reliable electricity supply. And as a result, today's targets for pollution reduction in Australia are inadequate, and they aren't properly, there isn't appropriate plans to deliver them. So the current policy of both major parties in Australia today is a 5% reduction in emissions by 2020. Now, given no economy-wide price on carbon, meeting this target based on renewable energy alone will require far greater volumes than the current 20% renewable energy target, or RET, which was designed, after all, to be a complementary policy. So recent Climate Institute modelling shows us that if our only emissions abatement policy is the 20% rate, Australia will not meet its 5% target and will be over that target by 170 million tonnes of carbon dioxide by 2020. Now, before I turn to the exciting Zero Carbon Report by BZE, I think it's important to give you a short introduction about Pacific Hydro, just purely for context. Pacific Hydro is one of Australia's leading clean energy companies with wind and hydro assets in Australia, the Philippines and South America. And while in Australia we own and operate over 300 megawatts of renewable energy projects, which are mostly wind projects, it is important to note that we are not a wind company. We are a technology agnostic and will employ commercially available renewable technology at the lowest cost and at the lowest environmental footprint. So, from Pacific Hydro's perspective, I think it's fair to say that BZE's Zero Carbon Australia plan represents something very exciting, the vision of an entire country powered by renewable energy. Now, I commend the BZE report, but not because it's a business opportunity, but because it breaks down many commonly held fallacies, and in particular, that 100% renewable energy supply is not technically feasible. The report is an important marker, establishing the technical feasibility of a fully sustainable energy system and making predictions on the costs to do so, and in a very short time frame. Many times I've heard political and industry commentators state that we need further technology development. And I've also heard criticism that the renewable energy industry does not have the capability to deliver significant volumes of new capacity. Well, while it's true that the industry has suffered from a decade of policy uncertainty, there are now more than 16,000 megawatts of projects under consideration and over 5,000 megawatts of projects already permitted. So I commend BZE on challenging decision makers in Australia to think more creatively about the transformation to a low carbon future in Australia and to highlight what is possible. I do think it's important to state that, in our opinion, the Zero Carbon Australia report sets out one possible scenario to achieve a clean energy system in Australia, and that was just noted previously. We believe there are many other equally achievable pathways incorporating a range of emerging renewable energy technologies such as geothermal and wave energy as well. And I recognise it's a pragmatic decision to model a single pathway and support that methodology. But I believe it will be important to ensure the report's findings are communicated in a way that highlights that the plan is not about picking winners, but establishing technical feasibility. Importantly, however, the Zero Carbon Australia scenario illustrates that whichever way you look at it, the transformation to a cleaner energy future will be challenging. One of these challenges is the necessary transformation of our transmission grid system to an interconnected national grid. The report rightly identifies the massive investment required to facilitate large volumes of distributed generation. Add this to the underinvestment in the existing grid over the last 20 years, which has left our existing network capacity saturated in many areas and in dire need of strengthening in others. As well as transforming the physical network, the accompanying regulatory and investment principles will have to change. Under existing market rules, private developers, such as Pacific Hydro, investing in the projects will have to pay for the total cost of the upgrades. This current approach will not facilitate a 100% renewable energy plan. Changing the market rules to facilitate new models of transmission investment will require greater involvement from government and institutional investors, and might include new mechanisms where governments carry the risks of initial investment but sell down their investment over time. Now, just as I said that, I realised it's not actually new, and there is precedence for that. For example, here in Victoria, the high voltage power line from the Latrobe Valley to the smelter at Portland was funded by the Victorian government and paid back over time. Another area of transformation will be community acceptance of large-scale change. Now, while polling continually shows that Australian communities overwhelmingly support renewable energy and want strong action on climate change, our experience as a developer is that change, particularly to the landscape in rural and regional communities, can be difficult for some people. These are big installations which will require large areas of land to accommodate them. Each solar tower proposed in the zero carbon plan will require 15 square kilometres of marginal farming land, and the proposed 6 megawatt turbines are tall structures and visible from long distances. So as we change our energy mix, whichever technologies are favoured in the future, it is important to recognise the need to work with communities to build support for the subsequent transformation of landscapes. The final major transformation is the need to create an investment environment to support the large-scale deployment of renewable energy. The recent amendments to the 20% renewable energy target legislation will unlock around $20 billion of investment. A plan the scale of the Zero Carbon Report will require much greater investment in the same time frame. Now, while most of the world recovers from the global financial crisis, causing governments to run significant deficits and funding institutions to have very low risk appetites, this funding will not be easy to secure. And with very low wholesale energy prices, as a result of the low cost of coal, it is a reality that renewable energy technologies cannot compete without supporting policies in Australia. But investment can be made available, either through a strong long-term price on carbon or from more direct schemes such as an increased renewable energy target or feed-in tariffs. And with investment will come jobs and economic activity. The report identifies that many of the jobs and much of the economic stimulus will be in rural and regional areas. And renewable power stations are jobs intensive. For example, it takes twice as many jobs to build and run a wind farm on a per megawatt basis than a coal-fired power station. VZE's work highlights the enormous opportunity for Australia. It shows that we can move to a much cleaner energy sector, that we can power this country from renewables, given we are awash with world-class wind, solar, wave and geothermal resources, and that we can have energy security without emissions. The task is now to work together with government, investors, business and communities to unlock this potential.
Thank you very much, Lane. For the last formal presentation, before we open up for discussion, I'd like to invite John Daly, who's the CEO of the Grattan Institute, an independent policy think tank, to give a view of Australia's renewable energy future and some of the issues around it. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you all very much, and it's a pleasure to be here, and I would like to add my congratulations to all of the 30-plus authors involved in this quite extraordinary piece of work. As a lawyer and economist, I did actually also do a science degree at the University of Melbourne, but as one housemate somewhat unkindly said as I graduated, I'm the first undergraduate to receive an honorary degree in science from the University of Melbourne. I want to focus tonight on the kinds of ways that lawyers and economists think about this kind of problem. As you try and do this sort of thing in the real world, and you have to deal with the fact that it's people that build things, it's people that pay for things, it's people that vote for things, and it's people that decide to do things. And so I want to ask, okay, how might that happen, and what kind of challenges does this report throw out to us? And there's no doubt it's a very big challenge. Now, Matthew kind of threw up $370 billion and just kind of quickly moved on, but that is quite a big number. And to put it in context, if you were to do that over 10 years, you're talking about spending every year double the Australian defence budget. you're talking about spending half of what we spend as a nation on healthcare, and we tend to think of healthcare as being pretty important. So we are talking about a significant challenge. And I think particularly if we try and do this in a very compressed time frame, as the plan suggests, we make that challenge even greater. There are significant diseconomies of scale when you try and do very big projects, as state governments, for example, discover when they do very large IT projects that I dare say you can all think about. Or alternatively, when you try and do projects in a real hurry, you also hit those kind of problems, and you could probably think of insulation projects or large school building type projects which have had those kind of problems. And school buildings are a really interesting example. We're talking about a very rapid rollout of something where we more or less know what we're building. We were building them, more or less to standard designs, and we were building them actually not particularly big projects at a time, $1, $2, $3 million projects at a time, and yet still costs have blown out quite substantially because, as economists would say, if you very rapidly ramp up demand, in reality supply doesn't catch up that fast, and therefore what happens in practice is the price goes up and a number of people become very, very happy and very wealthy. So there are some real issues with this, and it happens in the private sector as well. I mean, it's worth remembering that the rapid ramp-up of LNG projects in Australia has seen very rapid escalations in the costs of building those LNG projects, essentially because we've ramped up demand to build those projects very fast, and supply is taking a good time to catch up. The report obviously also makes a very big assumption that we can succeed in bringing down actual usage, i.e. that we succeed in becoming very much more efficient. And it also assumes that electric cars succeed in essentially taking over by 2020. I would actually probably agree that at some stage electric cars are going to take over, but whether it's by 2020 or not is we'll all see. Nevertheless, the really valuable contribution of this report is to give us an order of magnitude. Maybe it's not 370, maybe it's 450. Maybe actually some of the cost curves come down faster than we anticipate. Maybe there's some different technologies. Nevertheless, it gives us a kind of ballpark number to aim at, and although it's a big number, it's not an unimaginable number. And the report is, I think, very helpful in showing that the kinds of challenges that people are perpetually throwing out in terms of what I think Matthew described as the can't do people, in terms of generation, in terms of transmission, in terms of construction, in terms of resources, even in terms of the amount of concrete that we need, all of those things are eminently doable. And of course, one of the really interesting things about the report is the way that it points out that the long-run cost of doing this is actually pretty similar to doing what we are intending to do anyway. Because although there's a really big upfront cost, naturally the cost of running a solar-powered plant where basically the fuel is free is relatively low. I think one should be very careful about using Stern-type discount rates around 1.5%. Not surprisingly, the average commercial firm is very reluctant to do anything at 1.5%. Indeed, as we've discovered over recent times, mining firms are very reluctant to do things even for 6%. But nevertheless, even when you do take an 8% discount rate, as the report does, buried on page 170, you still more or less get a break-even point, but of course, you're doing away with a whole bunch of carbon emissions in the process. However, and this is the big however, to ask people psychologically to spend a lot of money up front to get a return sometime in the future is psychologically one of the hardest decisions you can ask anyone to make. So we need to be really clear that psychologically the choice we are asking people to make with this report is a very, very difficult one for people to make. However, the way for us to talk about that, I would suggest, is to start getting people to focus on what their other options really are. And one of the beauties of this exercise is that it gives us a real benchmark. Because the dominant strategy that people have been talking about as an alternative to this is essentially that we build a bunch of gas-fired power stations, turn off a bunch of coal-fired power stations, and then at some point in the future wind up building some very low cost, some low emissions power stations, whether they be solar thermal, geothermal, nuclear or whatever, at the point that the technology is really cheap and other people have developed it for us. There are some obvious issues with that as a strategy. In particular, it implies that we're going to build a bunch of gas-fired power stations and then ultimately turn them off. And that may turn out to be not a very economically attractive way of going about things. The report doesn't do this, and to be fair, that's not what it aims to do, but it does throw out a big challenge for economists to start thinking through the trade-off. Are we, in fact, better off to jump straight to these low-carbon type power generation rather than going through that intermediate stage of gas, which we know we're ultimately going to have to throw away? The advantage of going with gas is that we don't wind up at the wrong end of the experience curve. We get to build when everything's cheap. The advantage is also that we don't try and build everything really, really fast, and as I've already suggested, that creates problems of its own. On the other hand, we wind up avoiding building something that we know that we're going to throw away. The other option, of course, is to do nothing, which is not exactly what we're doing as a country at the moment, but it's not far removed. What we're discovering as economists at the moment is that this is turning out to be a really, really bad option as well. Because the problem is that the average builder of coal-fired power stations is looking at it at the moment and going, there is a very good chance that there is going to be a carbon price at some stage in the not distant future, in which case my plant is not perhaps going to be that economic for that long. More to the point, there are potential bankers of those projects, and as an ex-banker I can say, who are even more sceptical of that, because one thing that bankers hate is unpredictable risks not that far in the future. Similarly, however, we're in a situation in which potential builders of gas-fired power plants are saying, I don't know how long it's going to be before there is a carbon price, and I'm in this very nasty situation where I make money if there's a carbon price between about $35 and about $90, but if the carbon price goes above $90, I become out of the money again. So you're taking a very big punt as a builder of future gas-fired power stations as well. So if coal-fired people don't want to build power stations and gas-fired power people don't want to build power stations, what happens? The answer is nobody builds power stations. And when that happens, what happens is that the price of electricity goes up. That is actually the idea of having an electricity market. And that is exactly what we are starting to see happen in Australia at the moment. The only people who are winding up building anything are people who build basically peak-fired gas stations, which are cheap in terms of their capital cost, but very, very expensive to run. And the consequence of that is that power prices are going up. So I would suggest one of the real virtues of this report is that it starts to give us a benchmark to put against those other options. And as I said, those other options of going via gas to some kind of ultimately low emissions plant, or the option of doing absolutely nothing at all, are increasingly appearing to be less attractive options, and this report challenges us to figure out exactly how unattractive and exactly what might be the best way to go forwards. So let's assume for the moment that we are going to really try and implement this. What do we have to do? We have to manage three difficult problems. We have to manage the psychological issue of a very big upfront cost. We have to manage the fact that this only works if you apply, relatively speaking, non-commercial discount rates. And we have to manage this mismatch between supply and demand of construction activity. And the fact that if we really try and ramp up fast, there's a very good chance that we'll simply wind up ramping up, at least in the short term, the cost of doing all of this. So I'd suggest there are a couple of things that we will clearly need to do. We will need a high carbon price sooner rather than later. We will probably need government grants, in effect, to do this. We may well need government prizes to do this, and there's a very interesting trade-off between saying we'll hold a beauty pageant and a government tender with all of the bureaucracy that that entails, and at the end of that process pick someone and then hope that they actually manage to finance it and build it, as opposed to having government programs where we say we will provide a substantial grant to someone at the point that they deliver a plant that looks, roughly speaking, like this. And therefore leave it to the market to figure out who gets there. However, I would suggest there are a number of policies which we should not expect to deliver this. Firstly, the various programs that we have in terms of renewable energy targets are not going to deliver this kind of plan. By definition, what those kind of programs do is deliver the lowest cost renewables at any point in time. As of today, the lowest cost renewable is essentially wind, and the consequence of that will be that if all we do is have a renewable energy target, for the next 5 or 6 years, all that will happen is people will build lots more wind plants. Now that may well be a good thing, and indeed it's part of the plan, but the plan is also about building a large number of solar plants in the near future. And so my point is that a RET is not going to get you there. Secondly, banning people from building new coal and gas plants is also not going to get you there. It doesn't change the marginal cost of operating the existing plants, therefore it doesn't change the cost of the price of electricity from those plants, and consequently these kind of solar plants will be uneconomic. You need to have a carbon price to essentially increase the effective cost of generating power from gas and coal. Thirdly, gradually going for some kind of cap and trade scheme on carbon is also not going to get us there. These plants only work if there is a very high degree of confidence in a high carbon price for the foreseeable future. And one of the real problems with cap and trade schemes without a floor and without a collar is that they provide no assurance that carbon prices are going to stay high. Indeed, as the European Union has demonstrated, one of the problems with these schemes is, particularly as people start building renewable plants, ironically you get to the point where there's ample supply of very low, or relatively ample supply of low emissions electricity, and the consequence is that there are fewer demands for permits than there are permits, and when that happens, the price of permits falls to zero, or close to zero, and therefore the carbon price falls close to zero, and therefore all of a sudden your coal plants are back in the money and your solar plant is in deep trouble. So the consequence of that from an economic perspective is this kind of thing will only take off if there is an assured and very high, relatively speaking high, so we're talking well in excess, I would imagine, of $70 or $80 a tonne of per tonne of carbon. That's the kind of carbon price that you need. And finally, efficiency measures by themselves are not going to get you there. As the report itself demonstrates, efficiency measures are only part of getting there. And even if we are to hit the relatively unambitious target of a 5% reduction on 2000 levels, alternatively expressed sometimes as a 22% reduction on business as usual in 2020, efficiency improvements simply don't get you there. The final thing that we'll need to change from a policy perspective is clearly we are going to need to change the regulation of the grid. Clearly we are going to need to change how people get charged for extensions to the grid. And as Lane Crockett pointed out, that implies some quite significant shifts to the regulation of our grid. And as the report itself points out, the cost of upgrading the grid is about a third of the cost. One of the things that many people forget is that even today, something like around 50% of the cost of delivering electricity to your home is the grid as distinct from the generation piece. And as I think the plan illustrates, in some ways, that ain't going to change. So with all of that, I would suggest this is an absolutely terrific piece of work that really illustrates for us and sets a benchmark for what we would need to do if we are going to get serious about rapid reduction in carbon emissions in Australia. It provides us a benchmark for other options, and it illustrates very clearly that the kind of policy we will need to make progress on this is very different from what we are doing at the moment and what has been proposed in recent times. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, John. And now I'd like to invite the speakers up to join the panel, and doing so, open for some questions from the floor. But I will also invite a few additional panel members, so if the speakers could come up out the front. I'd like to invite Professor Peter Seligman up as a panel member, and by asking Peter, who has put some considerable thought into how one might Peter, come over. Peter's put some considerable thought into how you might design a sustainable energy zero emission system for Australia over a period of 25 years at a cost not dissimilar to this. So, Peter, how do you see a rollout on a 10-year timescale? Because I know gave you a few grey hairs thinking about a 25-year timescale.
Well, you're right, Mike, and it did. But on the other hand, the other way to look at this is what happened in the United States between 1941 and 45, where the merchant ship fleet was very depleted, and they had a program to build what we call Liberty ships. And so in this program, some 2,700 ships were built, and the first ship took 420 days to build. But by the end of the program, they were building ships in 42 days, and they were rolling out a ship every 3 days. So this is the sort of thing that can happen once you get the ball rolling. And yes, of course, if we ramp up a program very quickly, the prices will go up. But if you have a known good market for something, then the resources will come out of the woodwork, and this will be a bonanza, and people will be getting into this business. And if they know that they can continue to produce this equipment for a price that they make a profit at, then it'll all happen. So I'm not an economist, I'm an electrical engineer, but to a simple electrical engineer's thinking, this is not an insurmountable problem. We could roll this stuff out in a very short time if we put ourselves to it.
Thank you very much. I'd next like to invite Andrew Dyer up. Andrew is Director of Bright Source Energy, and I'd like to ask Andrew the question of, from business point of view, there's necessary lead times in organising yourself around such initiatives. So what are the challenges you would face as a company charged with delivery of such a system?
Thanks very much, and wow, it's amazing to see the huge crowd here, so we should have sold tickets to this. Certainly on behalf of my colleague Alan and I, representing people that actually build this stuff, we're certainly ready and capable of doing it. I think the speakers tonight, though, have articulated quite nicely some of the huge challenges ahead. In fact, Keith mentioned in his speech that the solar flagship program, will have 1,000 megawatts on the ground by 2015. In fact, that's not true. The current program has been modified so that it would only be about 350 megawatts by 2015, and quite likely half of that will be a coal plant. So, it's difficult for us to look at Matthew's fantastic plan and even look at the 2020 plan that is around in terms of 20% renewable if we don't get a lot of projects moving sooner rather than later. One of the biggest constraints is getting confidence in the banking sector that needs to provide the capital to fund the projects, that the technology will work and that the returns can be assured to the lenders and the investors. So the challenge right now is to really get consensus around what does our 2020 and 2030 portfolio should look like. And then work backwards from that. And I think once that is done, there's an enormous amount of work and projects that need to be launched today, tomorrow, next year and the year after to even meet the 20% target, let alone the 100%. All very achievable, but some big hurdles both politically and in consensus to achieve. So thanks for being here tonight. Look forward to the panel.
Thank you. Our final panel member is Alan Atchison, Director of ACS Cobra, and as we've heard, ACS Cobra has experience in actually putting these things on the ground, some of this equipment. So I'd just like to ask you, what do you see in regards to financing these programs as key issues from a company perspective?
Well, I think the point is to commend what John Daly was saying about this issue. Typically, projects of the sort of size that we're being proposed for the Solar Flagships program, we're going forward very much as public-private partnership or quasi-PPP projects, and that does require a large degree of debt financing and a large degree of equity being supplied by major companies, and it does require, therefore, companies that have experience and that have the stability and strength to be able to back up major investments in new projects. And so you do need big, stable companies like ACS Cobra and like the companies that Andrew represents. And that's why I suppose we were a little flummoxed when we saw some of the lead protagonists that were putting forward these hybrid solutions. And so, you know, we're very much, if it doesn't go forward that way, then we are looking very much at relying on the renewable energy certificate scheme. And I tend to agree with John also that if we just rely on that, then it's not a significant enough policy signal for new investment in the area, and we just simply won't get the finance that's required. But let's hope that we get some more policy signals in the right direction. Thank you.
Okay, I would like to open the floor to questions. We have some microphones, and it's wonderful to see so many people here. But if we could make just a little bit of room for the people with the microphones to get around, that would be great. So the floor is open for questions. One here in the middle, and then up there. So the question.
Yeah, brief question. Tim Flannery, in a recent article in the Monthly, said that Martin Ferguson is really the climate change minister in the government. He actually, as the resource sector minister, makes the decisions about whether solar power is a resource or not and how much to put into coal. And he was saying that effectively he's an anti-renewables minister. He's really the minister for the fossil fuel era that we're in, not the era we're moving to. I just thought if anyone was brave enough to wrestle with Tim's analysis.
Who's going to stand up? Who would like to take it? John, thank you.
Grattan Institute recently published a report authored by my colleague here, Tristanidis, and myself, looking at what is the impact on the Australian economy of significant carbon price. We looked at $35, but in order to figure out $70, you kind of multiply by 2. And in particular looked at, across the economy, at the impact of high carbon prices, which is effectively what's implied by the sort of thing that we're talking about. Firstly, for the vast majority of the economy, it's just not an issue. Something like 92% of the Australian economy emits, has a carbon intensity so low that at $35, you'd be increasing its costs by less than about 1.5%. Now, when you think about the impact on costs of oil prices, of shifts in the Australian dollar, of movements in wages, all of those kind of things, 1.5% just gets lost in the wash. You know, any company that tells you they're going out of business if their costs go up by 1.5% is probably already insolvent. So for the vast majority of the economy, it's not an issue. Then there are a bunch of emissions-intensive industries for which a high carbon price is a significant issue. And what we found was that for a number of those industries, including alumina, interestingly LNG production, coal, and it's worth remembering that a substantial proportion of Australian coal is actually dug out of the ground for the purposes of making steel. It's not exported for the purposes of burning it, it's exported for the purposes of making steel, and although there are some technologies in the wings that might reduce that to some extent, chances are we're going to continue to make steel as a world using coal for a hell of a long time. Those industries will doubtless be less profitable with a carbon price. That is, after all, you know, the idea. Nevertheless, they will continue to be very profitable. There are a very small number of industries, particularly aluminium refining, that will be in trouble. Although, ironically, if the aluminium industry doesn't get something that looks pretty much like this plan with very substantial government subsidies to shift to zero carbon emissions, its future in Australia is probably limited anyway, because if there is global carbon pricing, the one place that you are not going to be doing aluminium manufacturing is in Australia, where most of the electricity is fired by coal. So we found, and I think this is actually one of the big myths that we need to dispel as a community, although this may well be the great moral challenge of our generation, it is not necessarily the great economic shift of our generation. As the report points out, this is $37 billion a year, and as I said, that's not a little number, but it's also not an extraordinarily large number either. And consequently, if you do something like this, you're not therefore implying a complete, radical, massive change in the Australian economy. You're implying some change, but that's all.
Thank you, John.
My question again is to John Daly and to the business guys. If you were really setting out how to set up this carbon price, how would you do it? In particular, in view of the problem that we've said, the technology of some of these other things is bringing the cost down. So you could actually set the price too high down the track. And then my question is to the business guys, how do you react to John's model? Will that convince you that you should be able to invest?
Well, I've got a quick answer.
Very briefly, what I would suggest is a floor price which you impose via a tax. So you say, for example, that there will be a tax of maybe $70 per tonne of carbon emitted. And then as well, you have a cap and trade scheme so that for every tonne of carbon that you emit, you have to pay a tax of $70, plus you have to buy a permit at whatever is the going rate for permits at that point in time. And then, of course, you'll need to do some very careful modelling around exactly how many permits you want to have at any point in time. You need to set that with a fair degree of assurance into the future so that people can make a reasonable stab at what sort of point the permits will float to. That gives you a fighting chance of getting some kind of market signal so that you hit your carbon trajectory, but at the same time you provide an assurance about a floor price so that you know that you're not going to get undercut by a coal producer.
Andrew, do you have anything to offer?
Well, look, John's an economist and I'm an engineer, so I have a more sort of pragmatic view on this. And the best way to stop Hazelwood from emitting is to, in fact, turn it off. Now, it's important to realise that what keeps the lights on here tonight was a plan that was hatched probably decades ago, which laid out the energy supply for this state, and has worked very well based on what we knew at the time. But we do need a pragmatic plan that says, here's what we need to turn off by when and what we're going to replace it with. And it was pleasing to, in fact, see some press on the weekend about starting to turn off bits of Hazelwood, because you need to have an approach that is fair and reasonable to the owner to allow them to exit and do it in an orderly fashion. You don't want the plant just turning off willy-nilly. So I must admit my head gets a bit lost in carbon trading and cap and trade and all these mathematical things. I think we need a good, robust plan, as we did for decades in terms of transmission and generation. It'll be a whole new world in terms of how it's done in the future, and we need a plan to do that.
Thanks very much. Lane has a few comments.
Thank you. While we're on a roll. From the renewable energy industry's point of view, I guess one of the things we've really been striving for over the last number of years is that there's a price on carbon so that renewables can compete with polluting power generation on a level playing field. That's all we've really always sought for. But that would mean that renewables would be able to strive forward. But that's not going to build a 100% renewables plan. I think that's the point that John was making. If you want to produce something like the plan that's been put up here this evening, you're going to have to put really special and extra incentives and dynamics into the market to make that happen.
Thank you. One more question from here before I open up again to the floor.
I attended a seminar probably about 10, 12 years ago from the Alternative Technology Association, and the speaker there observed that there was a really good opportunity for Australia to get ahead of the game on renewable energy technology. And I'm hearing the same thing here tonight. So my question is, with the politics in Australia currently pushing out this greatest moral challenge of our time till 2013, and the current incumbent PM apparently about to do the same thing, Why can't we just do a carbon tax? What do we got to do politically to make this happen?
That's a challenge.
Could I have
Yes.
Okay, a complete novice perspective on policy. I'd actually like to speak up, well, let's say some pragmatism here. We seem to be struggling as a country to put a price on carbon anytime soon. We've all decided we should do it, but it better be in the future. Well, that's not quite getting us there. Let's be a bit pragmatic about policy. I think the renewable energy target legislation is pretty damn good. And it's the reason that we have a wind industry in this country. Now, I really like John's suggestion that with all of these policy things, what you must avoid at all costs is so much volatility that the price of the thing sends everyone out of business by falling down low. So I like this idea of a floor price, but he also made the really important point that if you try to pick winners and try to pick a price, then you can just have a lot of sort of profiteering. And there's lessons to be learnt from Spain where they're getting a lot of installed capacity, but most of it isn't that innovative, and they've done it by just putting a price on the electricity they buy. So back to why I think the renewable energy target's pretty good. If we had a renewable energy target that just simply ramped up to 100% by 2020, well, someone explain to me why that doesn't do it. There's a weakness with the renewable energy target as it stands, and why that wouldn't work if you just simply increased the target. There's a very weird thing that there's nothing in that target, in those certificates, that reflects the time of day that you generate, which is okay as long as the target's small. But supposing you just took that legislation and you said the certificates are worth a multiplier on the market price of electricity at the time you generated them, and then you just ramp the target up to 100%. Although another bit of pragmatism that I offer you, that could be too scary for everyone. If what you said as a government is that it's a target, but we're going to review it every 6 months, and every time we see that the industry can keep up with it, we will increase the target. And we'll just see how fast we can go, and we'll keep it all under control, and we can get on with it.
Thank you. We're going to take some questions from the back now. So some questions at the back. Go, the back. Give the back a chance, if there are any questions up there. The one over here.
I guess I'd like people's opinions on this. I mean, I think it's technically possible. The big question is how do we do it and how do we do it in time? And we do have to do it fast because the climate science is telling us we have to do it fast. But I think the answer is not a carbon price, but direct government investment. It was government investment which built every coal-fired generator in this country. Climate crisis makes renewable energy an essential service, and I think the government should build it like they build schools and hospitals. They should employ people to do it like they employ teachers and nurses and so forth. The other advantage to direct government investment over a carbon price is it wouldn't necessarily raise electricity prices and attack living standards. There's been carbon trading in Europe, it hasn't worked. There have been 6 European countries that have had a carbon tax since the 1990s, it hasn't worked. And I think this is a better path to go down. The other thing, in order to get there, I think what makes the politics so hard is the power of corporations, particularly the fossil fuel industry. Coal is cheaper than renewable energy. I think to get these solutions, we are going to need to build a mass movement. We're going to need meetings like this up and down the country. We're going to need to go to trade unions to put bans on coal-fired power, to start to fight for the kind of jobs that will save the world. And particularly to have concern not just for the owners of places like Hazelwood, but for the workers there.
Thanks very much for the comment. It's much appreciated. We will... I would like to try and keep to relatively succinct questions while we've got the panel of experts here, if possible. I'm sure we all have our opinions, but it'll take us several days. Has anyone got a... I'd like to move on to some questions at this stage. Thanks.
Yes. The Greens Party have a target of $23 per tonne incrementing every year. Is that going to work for us? Is that starting off too low?
Matthew, have you got an opinion on that?
Yeah, look, I think it actually depends on what they're saying about the trajectory. Like, are they guaranteeing it's going to ratchet at a certain rate? Because it all depends on, I think it's like 3 or 4% per annum or something. They're talking about it ramping, and and whether industries know what's going to happen in 10 years' time or so. So if the price ramps high enough, fast enough, then you could get in at some point ahead and install your solar thermal plant or something like that. But if the price is going to stay low, or you don't know what it's going to do in 5 years' time, well then you can't really invest in anything. I think that's pretty much the case. So.
I have a question in the middle here. Yeah, the microphone is just coming. The microphone is just coming.
How much time are economists putting into the cost of doing nothing? We constantly hear about the cost of changing to renewable energies. What is the cost of doing nothing compared with the cost, say, of the fires of January, February 2009?
Cost of doing nothing. I think we heard a little bit about that from John. Is there anything that we need to add to John's analysis? Anyone to make some comments? I think the cost of doing nothing is substantial from John's analysis.
I'd just like to throw in one. It's not really the question you're asking, but in contemplating this, whatever 360, 90, whatever 370 billion.
$8 per week per household.
The Martin Ferguson, whose name was mentioned previously, was quoted as saying not so long ago that we need to spend 100 billion over this sort of time period if we wanted to go ahead with business as usual with normal coal-fired electricity production. So doing nothing already costs you, in straight-out business as usual terms, about a third of this particular clean energy future. So,
and I'll just point out one more thing too about Martin Ferguson. His staff and himself have been briefed over many years by us. He knows all about baseload solar thermal long before any of you knew about it.
At the back there.
Comment. I don't know if it's exactly a question or just something to think about. We've heard about dollars per tonne, dollars per kilowatt, dollars per acre and dollars per many other things. We haven't thought about dollars per species lost.
Comments from the floor? I think it's probably a bit out of the realm of this particular panel expert, but clearly...
Can I make a quick comment on that one?
Thank you, Peter.
In terms of dollars per species lost, I have thought about this, and one of the problems which I've thought about, and I'd like to welcome some comments from the floor, from the audience about it, is that if we go to build these large solar installations, and for that matter, large wind installations, that in itself is going to have an impact on wildlife. And we have to think, as well as thinking about how we're going to do these things, we have to think where would we do them, where we would do the least damage. And a lot of people, of course, have thought about wind in terms of bird populations and so on. Very few people have thought about solar from the point of view of damage. If you look at a map of Australia, you're very hard pushed to find somewhere where you can just take out 100 square kilometres of land and say, oh, this is worth nothing, we'll just do it there.
There is no free lunch. Everything has a cost. I'll just take it in the middle here first.
This is very much an economic question. I think we keep talking about a carbon price, but it seems to me there are two different problems. We've got carbon that is part of the outmoded, outdated methods of technologies that we have, which we want to bring out of our economy. And then there the threat of increasing more of these sorts of outmoded technologies. So are there any thoughts around putting a very high price on any new carbon emitting, generating, problems versus gradually scaling out the existing ones, recognising that, they've known that carbon's been a problem for 20 odd years, but they are here, they are existing, and we don't want to create such a situation that when we do decide that we want to buy them out, we can't afford to. Does that make sense?
I think John might take that one.
I'll take that one. The issue with that is that the chances are in a free energy market, the consequence of that will be that no one will build anything. The price of electricity will gradually rise and rise and rise as we have more and more points at which essentially the gas-fired peaking stations have to cut in. Because the problem is that for most of the time, The existing coal-fired power stations will essentially provide the load. Their marginal cost of operating is very, very low, and consequently the price of electricity for most of the time will stay very low, and consequently there is no way that it makes economic sense for our colleagues here from solar thermal plants to build new plants. And so all that happens is that we wind up continuing to have our existing emissions and the price of electricity goes through the roof. Now that's exactly what is effectively happening at the moment. Because what's happening at the moment is, because of the uncertainty around the carbon price, no one wants to build anything, and although some people have recently got permission to build coal plants in WA, it remains to be seen whether they can ever get finance for those things. So we see exactly this happening. Basically, the price of electricity keeps rising, but emissions continue to be the same. So that's why simply putting a penalty on new plants doesn't get you there.
Thank you very much. I'll take this one from the floor and then at the back.
It seems to me that we want to reduce our carbon footprint in whatever form it takes. And I take John's point, it's big numbers, high risk, people are averse to risks of such big capital expenditures. And it is a very tight time profile to do it all almost in 10, 15 years. Well, let's share the load, let's spread it out across all industries, not just stationary power transport. We know that livestock produces more greenhouse gas emissions than all of transport put together. Cars, trains, buses, ships, the whole lot put together. So let's bring livestock in, and I'm so pleased to hear people like Matthew and Patrick and Pablo here talking about doing that as part of their next assignment. You have no idea how astonished I am, Matthew, to see. I've known you guys, seen you every day for the past 5 years, and to see the quality of your work has absolutely blown me away. And I've got to say, I think we need, say, 1,000 private individuals here to say we're going to support Beyond Zero Emissions, to enlarge their scope, and each of us 1,000 people will put 25 grand on the table. I'll be the first. I'll put 25 grand down, let's raise 25 million bucks and support you guys.
We're of course very willing to take many matching offers, but it's very, at the back.
Thanks. Congratulations on the report. It looks like a great piece of work. I get the feeling though tonight you're probably preaching to the converted. What's your dissemination plan? How are you going to get this in front of the can't do crowd?
Can I answer that? Well, I mean, first of all, you need to get your allies aligned, and I suppose if you're the converted, then you'll need to know the latest updated information that we've compiled and condensed, and so we've achieved that tonight, so that's step one out of the way. We're going to do this around the country. We've possibly, I can't totally confirm, but I think we've got the city, Clover Moore's got us the City of Sydney Town Hall to do it with a bit of a bigger venue, and Bob Carr within the month, so we'll do a Sydney launch. Then I guess from there we'll follow on to the other major capitals and onto regional centres. So we'll take it around the country. And you know, if it's $100 million to knock out Kevin Rudd with an advertising campaign, we get 1,000 public speakers. I reckon they're worth 100 grand each. That's 100 million. So if you want to be a public speaker, we'll train you up, and out you go into the community and take the message. Thanks.
Okay.
And you're right. I mean, it may be that most people here are converted, but we've just done some polling on renewable energy in communities, and we find that over 80% of people either strongly support or support there being new renewable energy. So it's already out there in the community. It just needs to be talked about more, and you know, you're the people that can do that, because at the end of the day, this may, if it's the greatest moral challenge of our time, it also seems to be the greatest political challenge of our time.
Thank you. I'm just going to take a couple more questions from this side and then get this side a chance. One here and then one at the back, and then we'll move across.
Okay, it seems to me there's one area that we haven't really covered, which is the psychological aspect. John did mention it, but I think it's much broader even than he mentioned. Our current Prime Minister says she's waiting for a consensus in the community. My gut feel is the consensus is there, but we don't know how to act. Matt's report is a brilliant step forward in that. It gives you something that looks achievable, but we've got a panel of engineers, business people, and economists, but I'm wondering if anyone's prepared to comment on the psychological aspect of this and how we try to address that.
Look, one thing that I'm encouraged by is that before we had a report like this, and I hope there's many more scenarios written by academic institutions around the country, if they're represented here, and governments perhaps, anybody can write a real thorough report like this so we can get the lowest cost transition, and we're going to do a version 2 that'll be better than our version 1, stay tuned next year. What we found is that even with the public not knowing that you could do the whole job with renewable energy, there's been enough of public support for going down this route that we've still got billions of dollars that have flowed into renewable energy, like for the wind industry, for instance. And that's happened when, if you vox pop people in Burke Street, you said, oh, what do you think of solar power? And, generally everybody loves solar, that'll be the answer. And then you say, well, what are you going to do when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, and they sort of pull back into their little hole? Well, we're now giving you the confidence that renewable energy can power the economy. So how many billions of dollars can we get out of the government now that we can strongly argue the case? So I think that's what this report enables the public to do.
So I would just like to put a bit of a plug for the new university initiatives here in setting up the new interdisciplinary research institutes, of which the Melbourne Energy Institute is one, which is really to bring together and harness the capacity of a broad-based university such as ours to bring the requisite intellect and wisdom from the different fields, the different ways of thinking to tackle these issues. These are very serious issues. It's a multifaceted problem that we face, tremendously challenging to understand how we not only do it from a technical and financial side, but give people the confidence that there is a future out there that can be sustainable. There's no one who doesn't want sustainability, but they also are secure in their own ways of thinking, and it's a huge challenge, and that's certainly our ambition here with the new research institutes, to try and help map those pathways. Some questions over on this side. Perhaps they're back away from the corridor, so we get some people on the external side to our gents.
Can I just ask my question first? Is that right?
Oh, sorry.
You did point to me
Go this
before.
way and then back to you. Sorry, I forgot.
Just a quick question about the investment. I mean, we're talking a lot about getting to a level where it becomes profitable for the banks to finance these kind of projects. Now, the only suggestion I've really heard is the carbon price and the carbon trading. From the private sector, is there a plan B? I mean, if carbon trading and the carbon price don't eventuate, if they just become something that doesn't happen, what else can we do to make sure that the investment is actually doable?
First of all, I'll throw that one to Alan and then to Andrew.
Just going back to some of the earlier comments, I actually would like to take slight issue with you, Keith, about feed-in tariffs in Europe. I think that feed-in tariffs offer a good alternative and a good way to guarantee a level of return, which is the baseline for any major investment in new projects. I also have a problem with the renewable energy target, in as much as you're trying to construct a market with a very small number of buyers. In Victoria, if you want to get a wind farm going, you've got 3 retailers you can go to, and they are hanging out the developers to dry. It doesn't matter what you do with the renewable energy targets scheme. You've got problems of oligopolies and problems of cartels and problems of a small pool and a government trying to orchestrate a market, in a sense, where you really don't have a big enough pool of consumers and buyers to make it really work. So I have less faith in the renewable energy target, I'm afraid, Keith, than you do. And I think that while I acknowledge that there may be difficulties with the feed-in tariff, it is the thing that has provided installed capacity in Spain and Europe. So that's my thought.
Perhaps I can answer the question by illustrating somewhere where it's working, and in California is a jurisdiction that's worth studying. Now, a big difference there is that you have a vertically integrated utility, So when they've got their RET target, which is 20% by 2010 and 33% by 2020, the retailer is also the generation company. So they're actually forced to do something. And I think this goes to Alan's point that, in fact, in this market here, a retailer can just opt out and just pay the penalty. There is no actual link between the RET target, which is on a retailer, and someone actually signing a cheque to build a plant. The second thing that the US has done is to provide what's called a loan guarantee, which is provided by the Department of Energy, and the funding is out of the Department of Treasury. So that allows you to get a major leg of the stool, which is to get your debt in place. No such facility is available here in Australia currently. So a combination of the loan guarantee and the ability to write 25-year power purchase agreements, which is a more sophisticated version than a feed-in tariff, is allowing major projects to occur. We really don't have any of those legs of the stool here in place, and until we make those changes and have a plan to work to, it just becomes all talk.
Thank you. Take the question at the back there.
Thanks. Just want to congratulate you on your fantastic report. It's very inspiring to see so many people here tonight. But I think the question for all of us is the point that was raised before about the political challenge that we face. You've shown us how technically we can do it, but we're facing a real problem of a lack of political power for those of us who want to see this report implemented. And obviously there's a range of ways we can do that. We've got an election coming up. At the moment it seems that the voters in marginal seats are the ones in say, Western Sydney, the ones that in a sense were part of knocking off Kevin Rudd and putting in Julia Gillard, are the ones that are determining whether we have a carbon price at the moment. And clearly we need to be creating some marginal seats for our side, and we have a big opportunity in Melbourne to do that at the coming election, to change this seat from Labor to Green. But my question is, I suppose, what happens after the election? How do we actually get more political power to our side of the equation? So my question is really to the renewable energy companies that are represented here tonight. We've seen the power of the mining sector recently on determining government policy. Are there ways the renewable energy sector can be stepping up and being much more engaged at the political level to get the policies we need, like a carbon price, to drive these sorts of changes? Because I think we can't do it. It's not enough for citizens to be doing it. It's probably the ballot box isn't going to be enough as well. We need some weight of the financial, I suppose, power of the renewable energy sector and other companies that have an interest in this transformation taking place. So I'd just like to get your comments on that. Thanks.
Anyone? Elaine?
So I approached this one with some nervousness. Well, I'm pleased to think that you think that we have some financial power. I think the reality is when we go up to Canberra, and we've been to Canberra a lot over the last few years, advocating strongly for the renewable energy target, we notice we're just passed endlessly by people from the fossil fuel lobby, and the numbers of which they are able to put people in those corridors just so far exceeds what we're able to do. It's fair to say that the industry's been working pretty hard, firstly for the target, and we have also been trying quite hard in terms of getting a price on carbon as well, and certainly that's one of our next big things that we're working on. But the reality is, I think, is that it's actually the power is with the people. And because you have seen that the way that the large businesses, as you rightly said, with the mining company, if you put your shoes in the, if you get into the shoes of, say, an energy minister or whatever, and the moment you talk about closing a coal-fired power station, you've been talking about compensation and lost jobs. It's a very difficult political decision that they're then trying to make. So it's only through really strong advocacy by all people and by the electorate that I believe will actually push through. Sure.
Now, I'm sure this is being beamed straight into Martin Ferguson's office, so we'll have to be a bit careful. Without sounding too radical, probably a simple thing is what the community can do is to reduce consumption. And we could buy a lot of time by reducing our consumption by, say, 20% per capita. The second thing to do is to turn off the dirty plants we don't want to see. And the third thing is the next plant that gets built in the country is the first one in Matthew's plan. And that would be a simple way to do it.
And of course, we do have to provide technically and financially robust and rigorous analysis to get there, and that's the purpose of not only this roadmap, but Peter Seligman's before, to show that many of the can't-do arguments really don't hold water. We'll take some one or two more questions from over this side. So the question is, how do we get the unions to back these plans? Matthew.
Yeah, well, I think working with them, sometimes it's hard to knock on the door and actually even get an opening, but if you can, you work with them, you identify where the manufacturing capacity for a large-scale rollout of solar thermal and wind could be located. It could be located in the same communities that would be hit otherwise by job losses, so their community has a future. And so then it's a chance for them to work alongside the people who are advocating for plans like this to actually say, okay, well, we'll get behind it, but we want the manufacturing capacity in our communities. And a bit of government money there might lubricate things in order to have the mirror system manufacturing, or the wind turbine blades, nacelles, gearboxes, all those components could be manufactured in those kind of communities. So that's their chance to bring those jobs home. And I think in some respects they're supportive on the construction side. Obviously it's more difficult when you're talking closing down existing facilities, but like I said, if it's the same locations where you're closing down the facilities, you're building the new capacity, I think you can get the buy-in of the unions.
Thank you very much. We're going to take one last question from...
Ferguson likes to talk about his enthusiasm for renewables, but there's also another technological fix in his mix, and that is carbon capture and storage. And I think one of the great things that this fantastic report has done is to allow us to throw down the challenge to him. Where's a comparable report that would justify carbon capture and storage? Because he won't be able to put one together. What does the panel have to say about that?
I might care to answer that one in my position here. Carbon capture and storage, is it not an option? For many parts of the world, it might not be an option. The challenges of the cost of capture. The costs of capture through research coming through this university are staggering, what they're showing. Now, it's research, it's not development at this stage, but no matter what choices we make here, and we have some wonderful geology to do, storage, to demonstrate what scale it would work. No matter what choices we make, the world will continue to live for substantial times on coal. I think it's our obligation to see how to make that work so the rest of the world can deal with its issues. But what I also strongly believe is that the equal funding should go into realising our renewable energy powerhouse solutions. We have an obligation to the world. We have had tremendous success from our cheap access to energy. All of these solutions need to be mapped out in a rigorous way, as has been done here, and I would strongly urge that we do the same and take the same opinion with carbon capture and storage. Of course, politics aside, there are issues with the politics. They frustrate all of us. The challenge is to understand at which stage they are able to deliver solutions or not deliver the solutions. Geothermal is an example. It's highlighted as a potential for Australia, but we don't know how to do it. It's an area I've been working for 20 years, and we still don't know how to do it. It'd be lovely if we did, but we don't. We don't know whether it'll be part of it. It's the opportunity of the research. It's our obligation here at the universities to take those on and demonstrate whether they can or can't be part of the solution for the world. Part of the MEI's role is to try and provide those roadmaps. I'm very delighted as the director of the Energy Institute to have been involved in collaboration, which has produced 2 such roadmaps, and I would look across the sector without bias to produce them as well. I'd like to finish my comments there and ask Susanna to come up and conclude proceedings.
I would like to thank our esteemed speakers, panel and chair for your contributions to the debate tonight, and the audience for your contributions. It's been very interesting, thank you. As a gesture, I have a very important gift. Hot off the press today, a copy of the report, so I'll just